let's dive into this thing. So, man, a little bit of background and then kind of some of my goals for what we're getting ready to do. My intent is for us to spend the next 10 weeks or so together every Wednesday right here at noon, working our way through a series of stories in the Old Testament. My actual goals are for us to do primarily two things. The first one is to create an understanding of how we read these stories. And then the second one is to help us figure out how we apply the truth that we find in them. So we're going to just kind of jump right into that today, but I want to do it by beginning in Luke chapter 24. And in Luke 24, we find ourselves at the tail end of the story of the life of Jesus. For those of you that might be familiar with this text, it's the story of the Emmaus Road. So these two guys are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. It's about a 7-mile trip, which, man, frankly, that's probably a 2.5-hour walk. It's quite a hike. But this is the day these two men are taking this journey. It is the day that Jesus rose from the dead, according to the stories we have in the scriptures. So that morning, two women, they go to the tomb where Jesus had been buried after he was crucified. They look for his body. They can't find him. They have a vision of these angels that show up and say, of course you can't find him. Jesus has been raised from the dead. Go tell everyone. So these guys are kind of catching wind of this, and now they're on this journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And as they're walking along, Jesus shows up, and what we find in this story is that for whatever reason, they don't recognize him. They can't tell who he was. So these guys are walking, they're having this conversation, and the text tells us that as they're walking along, they're discussing all of these things that had happened in Jerusalem, the crucifixion of Christ, his resurrection from the dead, although at the time they didn't really understand what that was or what it meant. As they're walking along having this conversation, a stranger walks up and says, hey, what are you guys talking about? And so they explain to him, to this stranger who we know from the story is Jesus, they say, man, what's happened in Jerusalem these last few days is crazy. We're not even sure what to think of it. They crucified Jesus. We thought he was the Messiah. We thought he was coming to redeem Israel. Instead, he's crucified and put in this tomb. And then this morning, our women go to the tomb. The stone's rolled away. It's empty. They have a vision of angels that say Jesus is not here. Right? And so Jesus responds to this, and he says in verse 25 of Luke 24, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and the reason we're actually starting here, is because one of the basic principles of Bible reading is if you see a word repeated, it's really important. They're trying to tell you that something is happening that you need to pay attention to. And so we find in these three verses the word all shows up 3 times. Okay, Jesus says, you're slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And then he starts teaching and he says, in beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to these two men what was said in all the scriptures about himself. Now, this kind of use of extreme language points out to us that something is happening. And what's interesting is Jesus walks along this road with these two guys for 7 miles, a couple hours, having a conversation about the Old Testament. He runs what was probably the most amazing Old Testament Bible study of all time, right, walking down this road. But he explains to them that everything in the Old Testament was about him. But that's a really crazy place for us to start a conversation about Old Testament stories. So just a little bit of background, okay? Why do I find this so interesting? Well, the Bible cross-references itself, okay? And that's kind of a fascinating thing to think about, because we can prove definitively that the Bible cross-references itself something like 63,799 times. Okay, so what that means is at some place in the text, there's a verse or a word, and that verse or word immediately references another verse or word somewhere else in the text. And it does that over 63,000 times that we can definitively prove. There's an awful lot of allusions that you have to kind of eliminate when you're trying to make a number like that. But so the number's at least 63,000, okay? I heard a guy speaking a couple weeks ago, and he made the point that the Bible was the first hyperlinked text, right? Which is interesting. It's interesting for, as I keep going, I hope you'll understand why. There are 66 books in the Bible. These 66 books were written by at least 40 authors. That number gets lower or higher depending on how many people you think actually worked on Genesis through Deuteronomy, but at least 40 authors. And those 40 authors wrote these 66 books over the course of about 1,600 years, give or take. Now, if we were to sit down in a room together, I mean, even if it was just a couple of us who are here, and we decided we were going to write a book, and we were going to make sure that that book was hyperlinked, that the text connected to itself some 63,000 times, we would be undertaking a massive project, something that's very, very difficult to do. But for that to have happened, when a group of men, over the course of 1,600 years, wrote a bunch of these different books, then they were kind of edited, literally sandwiched together, and they reference each other 63,000 times. The probability of being able to pull that off is astronomical. And one of the other things that I think is fascinating about this particular thing, about the fact that they collapsed these different stories together, is over 1,600 years, 40 plus authors, 66 books. When they stick them all together, they make a cohesive story. It actually tells a unified story from start to finish, which is also crazy to think about. And as we do that, Jesus, walking down the road with these guys, says this entire 66 books, 40 authors, 1,600 years, everything we find in it is about him. That's a crazy claim, crazy. But if what Jesus says in Luke 24 is true, if this is actually the point of the Old Testament was to point us to Jesus, then this becomes the single most important factor in the way we read and the way we understand the Old Testament texts. In fact, if what Jesus says here is indeed true, which I think we'll discover over the next few weeks as we read together that it is, but if this is indeed true, it probably means most of us have been reading the text wrong. We've been doing this Bible study thing incorrectly, which is kind of a bold statement to make, but I think we'll be able to kind of flesh that out together. Some today and hopefully more over the next few weeks. So, there are a couple of books that I'm going to toss out kind of quickly. There's a book called Jesus the Jewish Theologian by a guy named Brad Young. And Dr. Young is from Hebrew University in California. Brilliant scholar. But in his book, Jesus the Jewish Theologian, one of the things that I kind of clung to the first time I read it years ago was the idea that for Christianity, the religion of Christianity, the practice of the Christian faith, has an ideal life Okay, we look at Jesus and we decide that's what we should live like. We spend a significant amount of our time in church and in study by ourselves, if we're doing that, studying the life of Christ in the New Testament, reading the things that the New Testament teaches us about Jesus, and then trying to live the way Jesus lived. The reason that this is interesting is because when Jesus was alive, that was not true. And in fact, Jesus is a practicing Jewish man. They didn't have an ideal life to aspire to. When you study the writings of the rabbis, they weren't pointing people to a specific Jewish figure. They were pointing people to the Jewish texts. Now, for us, as of right now, where we stand in history, those texts were what we call our Old Testament. But to kind of make this point further, no one would say, you should live like Moses, for instance. What they would say was, you should study what Moses wrote and seek to live by the ideal of the writing. Okay, so instead of following a man, they were following the text. Now, Judaism was not just textual by choice, okay, although that was a big piece of it. Okay, these men chose to spend significant amounts of their time studying the scriptures and kind of living their life in them. But they lived in a very different world than we do, obviously. And the narrowness of that world helped focus them on this text. For instance, I can get information from the television. I can get information from the internet. I can get information by walking down to the library. I can hop on YouTube and watch teachers teach on any topic I want to hear. And we can actually do all of this directly through our cell phones, right? We have this tool with us all the time where we have access to all this information. And that information chain was not true for them, not even close, in fact. So what these men were doing was they were studying the text, they were studying the scriptures, men who were alive around the time of Christ and long before that, in fact, and they were studying these texts and they were reading these words. And there's a quote by a guy named David Wolpe that I loved, and what he essentially said was that in the first century, all of the energy that we spend focused on our everything from social media to television to movies to however we divide up all of this energy, all that energy was absorbed by the text. Okay, essentially it was absorbed into their study of the Bible. And he actually says, I want to read this because I don't want to mess it up because it's really cool. He says, they memorized it, but more than that, it was the touchstone of life experience. Life was sketched against quotations that had been embedded in their soul. And I love that quote, I love that idea, but these guys were studying the text all the time. My wife was teasing me the other day in a different conversation, but we were talking about how guys quote movies. Right? If you sit around in a room full of guys, movie quotes are going to become the language they start speaking with. This is essentially what was happening with these men, but they were quoting, and the lens they were filtering through was the Old Testament text. So not only did it show up all of the time in their lives, everyday conversations, besides even outside of their religious practice, it showed up in their family lives, it showed up in their interpersonal relationships. Everything was kind of filtered through that lens. And because of that, the amount of depth of thought and the amount of time that people spent in these Old Testament texts, the amount of time they spent writing about them, we have all kinds of information about these stories. Which I think also, before we dive into the first one, kind of leads us to the idea of the importance of story. because this is something that's not new to us. It's not something, we're not sitting in a room because the Old Testament stories are unique, although they are, but they're not unique in the world in terms of how story impacts us. For instance, if we just talked about modern day times, we would pretty quickly be able to see, like, man, in the 60s and the 70s, this collection of stories came out in movies. They were called Star Wars, right? They not only did they define fans for generations, but these stories have created a billion-dollar empire because we connect to story, right? That's not just true with Star Wars. You can look a little farther back and pick up fans of the Lord of the Rings, right? This trilogy and just captured the hearts and minds of millions of people. And right now we're kind of watching this phenomenon happen through the Marvel Universe movies, right? Billions of dollars spent watching, engaging in story. And even if you go beyond that, for most of us, we grew up hearing or reading or being told fairy tales. Stories that are hundreds of years old most of the time, that capture something about our world, and they communicate it in a way that we are now able to understand because of the story. And these stories have layers of meaning. Things seem very cute on the surface, right? Like Disney turns them into movies and we show them to our 5 and our 6-year-old kids, and these stories are engaging and fun. But when you start to understand the elements of these fairy tales, we realize that there's so much depth packed into these stories. They're teaching us about humanity. They're teaching us about how we interact with one another. And that's one of the things that's incredible about the Old Testament stories, is as we dive into these things, not only do we see this same kind of layer where there's a surface level story happening, and that surface level story tells us something about who we are and how we interact with our world. But the deeper we go, the more we find, the more it reveals about humanity, the more it reveals about who God is, the more it reveals about how we are to interact with who this God is that we learn about in the scriptures, the more it teaches us about who we are and the right way to live. And what's interesting about that to me is Jesus says that without unwinding any of that, he says, these stories are all about me. So not only are you going to have a chance to learn how you live in your world, not only are you going to have a chance to understand about humanity as a whole, not only are you going to have a chance to see these kind of cool stories play out right in front of you, but there's more to them than you already know. And that piece, the more than you already know, is captured in the life and person of Jesus, which, let's dive into a story and see what we can come up with. So, man, I had an Old Testament professor named Vernon Lee. Dr. Lee, if you're out there somewhere, hey, appreciated all that you had to teach. But one of the things that Dr. Lee used to talk about was an idea that he called a straw man. So he would set up a thought that we were going to light on fire, essentially, right? Like, let's burn this idea to the ground. And he would do that because it was an easy thing to attack, an easy place to start, right? So we're going to actually kind of set up the story of David and Goliath as a straw man. We're going to use it as an example of what we can find in these stories and then how we can sort of play them out. And I'm realizing already that I've probably said too much because I'm going to run out of time, and that's okay, but we'll pick it up next week wherever we leave off. But so the story of David and Goliath is found in 1 Samuel 17. And what we find in this text is kind of just to basically outline it. 1 Samuel 17 is a long passage of scripture. It's a long story. But in the very beginning, we find two armies, the army of the Philistines and the army of the nation of Israel. And these two armies have camped on top of two hills with a valley in between them. So this is during King Saul, who was the king before David. This is during King Saul's reign, and obviously the story of David and Goliath is one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. But so we've got these two groups camped on either side of this valley. Goliath, who is the champion of the Philistines, he's this great and mighty warrior, we're told, of the Philistine people. Every day for 40 days, he walks up to the front of this hill, the front of the Philistine lines, and he kind of taunts and mocks the nation of Israel, okay? Their army. And essentially he says, like, man, what's the matter? Aren't any of you guys tough? Or what are you afraid of? Just pick one soldier, send him out, he and I will fight, and whoever wins, wins, right? Simple. This is not unusual for the time, okay? So we know from other historical texts surrounding our Old Testament that this was a pretty normal practice, not just for these groups in the Middle East, but for lots of groups that expanded far out from there as well. We won't get into a whole bunch of that history. But what we do know about Goliath is the text, and I read and study from the NIV. The NIV and the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew it was translated from, describe Goliath as being 9 feet 9 inches tall. Massive. This guy's massive. There are some variant readings of that text that put Goliath at about 6 feet 9 inches tall. So depending on which one you want to go with, man, at 5'10", 6 feet 9 may as well be a different creature, right? It's not even in the same realm as me. So either way you go, this dude's a giant, okay, in comparison. And he has everybody scared to death. So finally, after 40 days of this taunting, David shows up, and he hears Goliath on the 40th day kind of taunt the army. And he decides he's going to take this giant on. And so with completely unmatched skill set and completely unmatched tool set, like Goliath is carrying all this armor and all these weapons, David, who's a shepherd, walks out carrying a sling and a staff, and most of us know the story, right? David throws this stone from his sling, he fells the giant, and takes out Goliath's own sword, cuts off his head, takes the head to Jerusalem. The Philistine army flees, the nation of Israel chases after them. David ends up taking Goliath's sword, and he devotes it to a temple, essentially, at Shechem, I think, or Nod, perhaps, but that's not the point we're making right now. So what happens is we have this story found in this text where this boy shepherd David shows up, faces down a massive giant, okay, beats him, and then sends the entire Philistine army running, and we go on about life, right? All of a sudden, the nation of Israel is free to go back to doing their thing because they've defeated the Philistines. Now, one of the first things that's interesting about this text is how we're taught to interpret it from the very beginning, right? So we have been told, for most of us who've grown up in kind of the American church culture, we've been told our entire life that this story paints a picture for us about how we can defeat our giants, right? In fact, this is the single most common interpretation of this story. God is going to help you prevail over the things that you're facing, over the trials that come your way. God's going to help you prevail, and you can defeat your giants. So this might get me in trouble later, but not only do I think that's not the point of this story, I actually think that is the single weakest interpretation you could make of the story of David and Goliath. I think there are, like we had just talked about just moments ago, there are levels to these stories. There's what happens on the surface, and then there's all of these meanings that get packed into them. And we know this is true because these rabbis we were talking about a few minutes ago also spent almost 1,000 years burying themselves in these words and studying these stories before Jesus even showed up. At this point, we have 3,000 years of commentary and conversation and writing about these texts, right? We know for a fact that there are layers to this story. And for us to start by saying, this story is about how you can defeat your giants. It might be, but if that's the case, that is the absolute weakest, surface level interpretation of this particular story from the Old Testament. So, we're going to dive into this thing, and I realize that I promised you guys we only have about 10 minutes left, but we're going to dive into this thing and get as far as we can and kind of see what we start to develop out of this story. So I'm going to just read a couple of verses and stop, and we'll pick it apart, and we'll do that a handful of times. So 1 Samuel 17, starting in verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Succoth in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. Now, this is actually really, really cool, but it's also really important for the way we understand not just the story of David and Goliath, but a ton of stories in the Old Testament. So, oops, my black marker may not be dark enough. Let me see what else is in here. Hang on. So there's these two hills, right, that descend to a valley. That's probably even worse. Hey, can somebody type on Facebook? Can you even see that? No, I don't think you can. Let me try something else. We're going to just keep working through markers. Hey, this red one might work. Okay. Oop, no way. Long story short, top of a hill here, top of a hill here, valley in between. Now, what's interesting about this, and the reason that we stop right here to look at this structure, is because the idea of going down in the scriptures has a lot of deep and powerful significance. Okay, the idea that we move down is not only geographical, but it also is a spiritual concept. So every time in the Old Testament you find the Israelite people or a specific person from the nation of Israel goes down, it's a representation of them descending into chaos or darkness. Okay, now, the way we build this idea is crazy, and I'll do my best to try to make it make sense. And hey, Andrew and Chandra, thanks for telling me you can't see that. Two hills, valley, right? But as we move down, this idea actually begins all the way back in the book of Genesis in chapter 1. And it happens in a really crazy way that actually is part of a story that's even older than our book of Genesis. So, what we as humanity know as the oldest creation story is actually a Ugaritic story. It's the story of Marduk. Okay, and there was essentially this god Marduk who had to face a giant dragon, and the giant dragon was named Tiamat. Okay, and so in this ancient creation story, the god Marduk slaughters Tiamat and cuts his body in half, and he sticks half of it in the sky and half of it becomes the earth. Okay, and so what's interesting about this is the god Tiamat in this story was chaos. It was the representation of chaos. And so Marduk shows up, he slaughters the chaos, and then he divides the chaos and he makes creation. In Genesis chapter 1, in the story of creation, literally just in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? The earth was formless and empty, and darkness was on the surface of the deep. Now, the word deep in Hebrew is the word tehom. Okay, Tahom is actually a derivative of the Ugaritic word Tiamat. Okay, so this story begins in Genesis. The people that were living when Moses wrote this story down would have been able to catch on to some of this, right? So this idea of the deep is the idea of chaos, and it exists underneath everything else that's happening. And so even in the beginning of Genesis, we find this idea of you descend into chaos, and it starts just in this one word. Well, as we fast forward from there, we find out that, and I'm just going to try to grab some snippets that will hopefully make sense. But the story of Abraham, right? God calls Abraham out of his country. Abraham goes for a long walk on this journey. God sends Abraham into Egypt, but what we're told is Abraham goes down into Egypt, okay? The descent, it's a physical, geographical word that describes the way he goes from the land of Israel to the nation of Egypt, which is a journey south or down, okay? But what we find out happens to Abraham in Egypt is he faces kind of some intense trials, okay? So the descent down is a descent into trial. It's a descent into chaos. Okay, we can pick this same theme up with the story of Moses, right? Moses is a slave in Egypt, but I'm going to back that up just a minute. We actually pick this story up with Jacob and Joseph, because Joseph gets carried as a slave down into Egypt, okay? His brothers and his fathers follow him down into Egypt. Eventually, the nation of Israel is captured in Egypt and they become slaves. Every time the Old Testament text paints a picture for us of someone going down, it's a descent into chaos, okay, which makes the way this battle is set up from the very beginning interesting. Okay, it's just an interesting detail in the text that what's going to happen is that for these two armies to square off, they are going to have to descend. And as they descend, they are going to descend into chaos. And if I haven't done a good enough job painting the picture of how that works in the text, which I probably haven't, but if I haven't done a good enough job painting the picture of the way that works in the text, anyone who's been in any kind of a fight can tell you are walking into chaos, right? So whether that's, a barroom brawl or a high school fist fight or, two armies of people modern day unloading all of their weapons at each other, it is a descent into chaos, okay? So one of the reasons that we picked this as our starting point, this descent into chaos, is because we find something really interesting out about Jesus. In the New Testament, one of the writers writes, and they tell us that Jesus descended after his death into hell. Right now, this continues kind of our theme, right? When I go down, I am descending into chaos. I'm descending into, nightmare, right? We intuitively understand this same concept because we talk about hell as being beneath us. Right? Now, this isn't kind of a new Christian development. It was actually the same way all of the ancient worlds processed darkness and evil. They believed these things were underneath them. To get into Hades, the realm of the dead, in Greek mythology, for instance, you descended into it, right? Our Christian tradition teaches that hell is down, right? We move down into it. And we're told in the scriptures that Jesus, after his death, he descended into hell to fight for us, to take over the control of the keys of death and Hades, is the passage, actually. But the story of David and Goliath begins with a description that whoever comes out is going to have to descend, make this descent into chaos. I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit because I realize now I'm crazy short on time, so just bear with me, okay? In the next few verses of chapter 17, we find a description of Goliath, and this is important, the way they describe him, because they outline his armor, they outline his weapons. man, for heaven's sake, they describe his spear had an iron point that weighed 600 shekels. That's like 15 pounds. I mean, I can't imagine swinging a weapon that had a 15-pound weight on the end of it. I'm not sure I could swing it, let alone actually use it in a fight. But the reason this description of Goliath is important is because they're painting a strong contrast for us between the warrior that Goliath was and the shepherd that we know David is. Right? Goliath is covered in armor, his helmet. He's got protection on his legs. He's got a massive sword, a massive spear. He is this mighty warrior. And as we keep jumping forward, we find, Goliath insulting the nation of Israel. We find David kind of wandering into this story. But one of the things I want to stop and point out happens in verse 16. And in verse 16, we find this. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and every evening and took his stand. Okay, so the nation of Israel is at the top of one hill. The nation of the Philistines is at the top of the other hill. And every day for 40 days, Goliath walks to the front of his army and he starts taunting the nation of Israel, right? And in fact, there's even a spot in the story that tells us Goliath walks into the valley and then starts taunting Israel, which is also interesting when you think bad guy descends into the chaos, starts taunting the other army who doesn't want to engage in the chaos. They're so frightened by it, they can't even walk down into it, right? But so this happens for 40 days, and the number 40 is crazy in the text. As you study the number 40, you'll find a couple of things. First of all, there are some people, I don't necessarily agree with this, but there are some scholars who assert that the number 40, when you see the number 40, you're supposed to just assume it means a long time, that it's not specific or accurate, okay? However, there are an awful lot of people who believe that when you see the number 40, it actually means 40, right? So we believe that there were 40 days where Goliath is taunting the nation of Israel, but every time the number 40 shows up, every time is an overstatement in this particular case, but consistently when the number 40 shows up, the number 40 shows up with a trial or a period of chastisement or a period of slavery, something like that. So for instance, the nation of Israel was enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, right? This is 40 times 10. It's an extreme amount of slavery. That's what the text is, that's what this detail in the text is insinuating. There's a big amount of time that has passed here, but it's this trial, chastisement, chaos in an extreme amount, okay? But what happens with the number 40, what we find with the number 40 in this, is that this trial, this chastisement lasts for this same time frame, the number 40. Goliath is taunting the nation of Israel, right? Well, it doesn't take much reading into the New Testament before we find out one of the first places Jesus encounters trial is 40 days in the desert. Right? So we're told in Matthew that Jesus goes into the desert and fasts for 40 days and 40 nights. And at the end, the devil shows up. Right? Well, this journey into desert is a journey into chaos. It's a journey into exile. We're going to outline that over the next 10 weeks very clearly, I hope. Jesus takes this journey into chaos. Right? Ironically enough, I think I may have just lost my... hang on, guys. Ironically enough, this descent into chaos in the desert for Jesus is a physical descent, right? He has to come from where he is down into the desert. It's a geographical descent, okay? But then we see the same thing happen in David and Goliath, and we see the same thing happen for the life of Jesus. For 40 days, they go through this chaotic taunt, only to wind up at the end in the middle of an incredibly important trial. It was incredibly important for what we're going to find out David was able to accomplish. It was incredibly important for what we find out Jesus was able to accomplish, all of which we'll pick up next week. All right, so man, Rick, James, thanks for hanging out with me. All of you guys on YouTube and Facebook, thanks for tagging along. We will be right back here next Wednesday. And if you have questions, please be sure to post them in the comments. I will do my best to get through those as we go.